Mini episode 1651 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1651. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris here with you, and we are breaking down the realignment in college football. This has been a multi-year story. Every summer there's been more developments heading into the season, and this summer was no different, even if it was a little bit later in the summer. And it's one of those things where for a long period of time nothing happens, and then something substantive happens, and that causes, you're getting this immediate thing, then the news cycle gets jump-started. Oh, there's a meeting of the college president and, internally at this place, and they got to make their decision on moving forward. So we saw that, and nobody better to break it down with than our regular guy for talking college football with on the program, an outstanding dignitary of the FDH Lounge. He is a writer at the great site, Our Sports Central. My man, Fran Stuchbury. Nobody better to get on to talk college football than him. And Fran, a lot of developments that happened here because, again, once a couple of teams started jumping, that started the dominoes yet again.
Yeah, I mean, Greg, as we said last year, we expected dominoes to fall, and a lot more fell than I realized.
Yeah, and this year it took a little later in the summer because traditionally the last couple of years, I think it's happened in July, maybe sometimes in June a little bit. Not necessarily right on the eve of the season, but a lot of them happened in August this time around, and you had a lot of teams starting to stare down the barrel of what was going to be happening. It seems like the catalyst for all of this was the very, very disastrous Pac-12, their solicitation for media rights going forward past this year and how their games were going to be televised. And they end up getting this piddly offer in, I believe it was from Apple, and it wouldn't have come even close to what they were looking for financially, plus the whole thing. I hadn't even considered this aspect of it, and I should have, but players appearing behind a paywall, what's that going to do for their pro prospects? Now, granted, in the day and age of YouTube and everything like that, you could say, well, they'll be seen, or maybe Sports Center, but again, ESPN, they have long operated for at least 20 years now as basically like a protection racket. So if they're not covering you, they don't really care about you. So it's not like Sports Center was going to bail out the Pac-12 players as far as getting exposure moving forward. So once that thing went south, A, not enough money, B, the whole implications of being behind the paywall, that's when the Pac-12 implosion started. First slowly and then super dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, Pac-12 imploded. That's the thing. That's crazy how it imploded. The team just scrambled. And the team that moved first, Rick, was Colorado. I mean, they moved quickly. They got out of there. First domino to fall, and Coach Prime, got into a good situation in the Big 12.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many times you could say in the history of college football that there has been such an impactful hire before a game has even been played. But this is a thing where, again, in terms of the way that Colorado has already been transformed before their first regular season kickoff, which of course comes this next Saturday from when we're taping this, this is one of these things where I just think, there's no way that the Pac-12 or the Big 12 is offering them any kind of a lifeline, or anybody else would have been sniffing around without Coach Prime having been there. They would not have been that attractive, and I'm here to say they might be stuck in the same boat as Oregon State and Washington State, still glued to a defunct conference, if not for that hire having happened. But as you said, they're the first ones out of the gate because now they're a hot media property.
Yeah, I mean, they have the marketing, the exposure, and the thing is, the other teams, the Pac-12, followed them quickly with Utah, and Arizona State.
That's right. They followed them out the door. Subsequently, Washington and Oregon to the Big Ten. And this is a thing where, again, just leaving the Pac-12 as a rump at that point to where, again, you're down to just 4 teams, but Cal and Stanford, as we're taping this now, increasingly playing footsie with the ACC. Apparently, SMU coming into play. And this is one of these things as well where conferences are looking at, among other things, they're looking at their footprint in terms of large markets. Now, large markets are not necessarily always synonymous with big interest in pro football. In New York City in the Northeast, not that much interest in college football, but they're still valuable to have. We saw all of this really kind of start when the Big Ten expanded with Rutgers and Maryland, thus bringing in the New York area, the D.C. area, and essentially the entire Eastern Seaboard or Upper Eastern Seaboard. You're seeing a little bit of the same calculation here for the ACC moving forward. SMU, what's that program worth on its own? Not necessarily a whole lot at this point, but oh, by the way, they got the Dallas market, or at least part of it. They share the Dallas market, of course, with TCU. And then, of course, the Bay Area market, which, again, ironically, not much of a college football market, but Cal and Stanford bring you that. So as far as the number of potential eyeballs, again, you've got a situation where SMU isn't even necessarily the biggest team in their own market, just because, again, you got Texas fans there, you got Oklahoma fans, but at least theoretically, you bring in the Metroplex market of Dallas-Fort Worth, you bring in the Bay Area market with Cal and Stanford, and that's got to be worth at least something. Clearly, that's the calculation for the ACC officials going forward, as far as trying to keep this thing a viable entity, because you've already got schools like Florida State that are kind of sniffing the exits, maybe looking at private equity to see if they can front them the money to try and get out and break this stranglehold of a grant of rights. So the ACC, I give them credit. They're being proactive in the situation they're in, because the situation right now we know is grow or die. And if they don't grow in some form or fashion, they're going to get picked apart by the other 3 conferences.
Well, the thing is, Rick, I mean, if these teams become involved, ESPN's going to give them a lot more money. I mean, I know Stanford's not a good football program, but they win so many other sports. Women's college basketball, other sports they've done pretty well, so that's going to help out ACC and the non-football sports.
Yes, and supposedly from what I'm hearing, Notre Dame, which has got this quasi but not really affiliation with the ACC, they're pushing for the ACC to bring in Stanford because they would like to see that be a closer tie to Notre Dame. And so it does appear that that could potentially be on the board. And that then leaves us with Oregon and Washington State and what they're going to do. And it's one of these things where, again, as phony as it would be for them to try and take that name and glue it onto another conference, a smaller conference right now, marketing-wise, it would seem like the best thing to do. If you could go to like a Mountain West or whatever and say, hey, we have the intellectual property and all this kind of stuff of the Pac-12, would you like to, quote-unquote, join our conference all collectively? I mean, that might be making the best of a bad situation for them.
Probably more TV money. That's the biggest thing, Rick. That's all this is all about. It's not about families. It's all about TV, money.
It is. And that's where, again, you look at the Big 12, and I was not necessarily wowed by some of the moves they made last offseason. The aforementioned bringing in of, UCF this year, and Cincinnati and Houston and BYU. But BYU at least brings a brand name in college football. And, oh, by the way, now with Utah coming in, now you get to have that rivalry rekindled. But when you look at it in terms of markets, and the fact that the Big 12 now has for the first time a foothold in the football crazy state of Ohio, you've got that, you've got Houston, you've got the Orlando area. So once again, in terms of markets, in terms of footprint, these moves that I wasn't necessarily wowed with last summer in retrospect are gigantic, because it seems hard to believe, but like a year ago, it seemed like they were about in the same boat as the Pac-12, and there was potentially talk of the Pac-12 maybe trying to raid them. But the proactive moves made by the Big 12 in the last year, the thumb-twiddling moves of the Pac-12 this year have led to, between the two conferences, the dominance of the former and the irrelevance of the latter.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, the thing is, Big 12, situation itself now they have 16 teams. I mean, be a team that, that justifies being at least 2 teams to make the college playoff next year possible.
Well, and let us not forget that what we have for the college football playoff, of course, it's going to change after the 2023 season and the 2024 move to the 12-team playoff. But this is basically an interim kind of a deal for the length of what is the existing college football contract, which I believe goes through either 2025 or 2026. So it's going to be recalculated moving forward on this. And it's going to be something I would think that reflects the dominance going forward of, again, the Big 12 has at least put itself in that conversation. You've got the SEC and the Big 10 as the two dominant conferences. You've got the Big 12, and it would seem like the ACC probably with enough heft to stay in that conversation and probably guarantee that those four champions are the ones that get the first-round byes in the playoff going forward. And then 5 through 12, if you do see a Pac-12 that is now basically a more minor league version of that, they're going to be in the same boat with the other group of 5 schools here going forward, it would seem like, of where they're not necessarily going to be guaranteed anything. One playoff spot for all of them potentially out of the 12, and then essentially the Power 2 or Power 4 conferences, however you define that, gobbling up like Ms. Pac-Man, it would seem, most of the remaining football wildcard spots.
Well, it depends on what they do with the conferences. I mean, if there's no Pac-12, then hypothetically, I mean, there's only going to be 5 of them. So 5 power conferences that get bids, and then 7, if there is no Pac-12. So
yeah, and that's the thing. A Pac-12 that's no longer a power conference essentially kind of puts it at 4 power conferences. So that's the whole thing. Because they can walk in there and they can say, we're still the Pac-12. We're the conference that is the lineage of John Wooden and O.J. Simpson. Okay, maybe they wouldn't brag about O.J. Simpson, but you know what I'm saying. All the lineage of that. And then everybody, the rest of the world's going to look at them like, yeah, you're Oregon and Washington State fronting this thing, and the amount of lineage that you have out of this is very minimal. It probably starts and stops with Mike Leach, the late, great Mike Leach. So, in looking at this here, how the conferences are situated going forward, are you going to see the Power of 5 conferences continue kind of rating one another to try to get a step up? I don't think any of them are going to be considered a Power 5 conference just by rating the likes of each other at this point. So where it goes from here, I know we said a year ago, like we thought that probably most of the moves that had happened would happen, and that was basically right, because this year is not necessarily as much as you'd seen collectively in 2022 and 2021. But it's like, are we reaching the critical mass now? Because I think we are, of like, there's still going to be some moves here or there, but I don't think there's going to be anything that adds up to the drama of what we've seen in the last 3 off seasons.
Oh, it's definitely the case, Rick. Let's talk a little bit about the Olympic sports. I mean, the travel is going to be insane, Rick. For volleyball, gymnastics, basketball. Well, basketball is, they travel a lot anyway, but it's those non-sports, again, the travel is going to be insane. Imagine going from like UCLA to Rutgers, or UCLA to Indiana, or Washington to Minnesota. It's going to be insane, right?
It is, and that's where I would wonder in some of these sports here if they might not be thinking of moving towards maybe like neutral site meets on the weekend, because, like for golf or tennis or whatever, I know that's already the model for bowling, of where they end up having, tournaments that like multiple schools are involved in. But like, say if the Big Ten over the course of a season in one of these sports, if they could fit in the course of a weekend a bunch of different matchups in there, it would probably mitigate the travel situation a little bit of where everyone is coming to at least a central location, and that would maybe save how much you're having to go to the individual schools, especially during the week.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case, but like I say, it'll be tough for families too to want to watch the kids play a lot. But now, I guess I'll have to watch more on TV.
True, and I will say that's a luxury that again with the conferences now that like our parents didn't have when we were in college, is the ability, had we been playing any of these sports, to at least watch them on TV or the phone or anything like that. So it's going to be a little bit rougher for the kids in terms of travel, but paradoxically easier for the parents to see them because, it's the 21st century and there are all these different options for being able to view things. So you're right that it's a huge part of the story that's not getting talked about as much, because a school like Stanford that has been dominant in the quote-unquote Olympic sports going forward. You're seeing how much that gets them. Nobody cares as far as being put into a conference here and how attractive that makes them. And we've already seen it to a certain extent also with Kansas, because and to a certain extent North Carolina, who's not unattractive, who's able to hold down their spot in the ACC. But if college basketball and March Madness and all of that came even close to bringing in what college football does, you'd see Kansas and North Carolina and Duke and schools like that being hot tickets, and they are most certainly not. They're just another school in this mix.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case with these teams being shafted, and now it's just now the teams are just they're getting paid handsomely, and the thing is, the contracts are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's going to be a lot. 10 years from now, we're going to be blown away by the TV deals these conferences have.
Well, there was a column in The Athletic, I believe it was Bruce Feldman, who was pitching the idea of potentially relegation here at some point. And that's a thing where I just don't see legally how this thing can happen, because if nothing else, you got to think schools like Northwestern and Vanderbilt must have very, very good lawyers when you look at their alumni base. But that some of these schools that don't bring as much to the table, in terms of perception, Indiana or Purdue, it's very easy to go down conference by conference and sniff out the schools that would be deemed as not bringing enough to the table and getting an equal piece of the pie with the Ohio States, the USCs, the Georgias, etc. So I'm dubious of that at this point in time, because it would seem like these schools would be on solid enough legal ground that they could say, we've done nothing to get ourselves ejected from the conference, and being able to win in a court of law, which is where this is going to be headed. That's the bottom line in any of this. Nothing counts aside from your ability to win in a court of law. That's the reason that these schools are all still bonded by cement to the ACC with this ironclad death grip of a grant of rights through 2026. So are you as dubious as I am that could be part of the end game with the quote-unquote lesser schools getting dropped by the greedy conferences, or do you see a scenario where that could potentially come into play maybe by the 2030s or so?
I don't see them being dropped. These teams are in the conference. I can't see the Big Ten dropping these teams. I can't see the lower teams. They're part of the puzzle. That's why they went to the Big Ten. That's why Rutgers went to the Big Ten. They're all part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So they're not going to walk away from that. They're not going to cut teams out. There's no reason to.
I agree, because it's an existential death struggle for those programs there. If you're Northwestern or Indiana or whatever, that's a death blow to your program if you get cast out of a major conference. So this entire thing, anytime I see an article like that, and I'm not necessarily criticizing The Athletic for having run it, and certainly it definitely gets clicks, as it did for me in reading it, but it's a thing where you can look at it and say, well, the financial pressure is going to lead to it eventually, but the financial pressures and the greed and everything like that mean nothing aside from your ability to win in a court of law and make it happen. And in a court of law, I would think that these schools are safe from being ejected, because there's no criteria in their collective bond that would allow them to say, you're not holding up your share of the load, you're gone.
Yeah, it's definitely the case, Rick, there's never going to be a situation like that. Teams that have lost for years, Rick, still, be part of the conference and they still get paid, so.
Yeah. I don't think anybody's going anywhere. I agree with you. Any additional thoughts on the realignment situation here? We're coming out of our third sort of epic summer in a row, and I know you and I both think that most of the big dominoes have fallen, but going forward, any additional thoughts on what we might see?
Well, I see SMU and the Pac-12 teams probably even taking no TV money for several years just to get in the ACC. That's how desperate they are. So they're so desperate just to get into that conference. So I can see that happening. But Oregon State and Washington State. We'll see what happens. They'll probably go to Mountain West, or if they can somehow keep the Pac-12 name and bring those Mountain West teams over there. So make it more appealing for more money. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating picture here going forward, as it's been watching it happen the last couple of seasons, and always great to get to do the analysis with you. Thank you so much, Fran Stuchbury, and thank you, everybody, for joining us for FDH Lounge Mini Episode 1651.